Stella woke up just in time to introduce today's lecture. She's not very happy about it, but we're talking about Thomas Southerne's adaptation of the novel Orinoco. This is Thomas Southerne wearing his best wig and his jowliest jowls, and he was an Irish writer. He was born in 1660, the year that Charles II, as you'll recall from the previous lecture, the same year that Charles II was restored to the throne of England. And he died in 1746. He wrote 10 plays, many of which stayed on stage for decades. And his version of Orinoco, his play adaptation, was extremely popular. Probably critics say one of the most popular plays on the stage post-Shakespeare. So performed and reperformed, and as time went on, edited to become more and more anti-slavery, though from what you saw in the first, in the adaptation you read, not so anti-slavery in its original form. He was a friend of John Dryden, who you may have heard of. Dryden was England's first poet laureate, and he was also good friends with William Congreve, who was another famous Restoration dramatist who wrote a lot of good comedies. In 1990, his works were collected and published, but he had been pretty much forgotten by that time. He also had discrete Jacobite sympathies. Jacobite spelled Jacobite. Jacobite comes from the Latin word for James, which is Jacobus. So those who had Jacobite sympathies or were Jacobites, and you probably know this if you've read or watched the Outlander series, they supported the deposed king James II and his descendants. James, Jacobus, therefore, if you supported James and were unhappy that he had been removed in favor of his Protestant daughter and her Protestant husband, then you were called a Jacobite. So Ben, royalist, Southerne, also a royalist, but a supporter of the previous monarch, James II, who had been removed. This is the title, one of the title pages of the printed version of his adaptation, and we'll talk about images like this and this title page in our discussion. But I wanted to show it here. One key difference in this version of Orinoco is this woman right here. Her name, now pronounced Imoinda to fit within the iambic pentameter of the play, is a white woman. She is no longer an African like Orinoco. So that definitely makes some big differences, and we'll talk about those during discussion, and I'll point out some of the effects that difference has as we go along here. Once again, we have an address to his patron, which is not included in the Norton, the section that I gave to you, but this is an excerpt from it, and it is addressed to His Grace William, Duke of Devonshire, etc., who was the Lord Steward of His Majesty's household and one of His Majesty's most honorable privy council. So basically that means that he got to stand in the same room that the king, when the king was getting dressed. Basically, it was a very high honor to be able to help dress the king. So this patron of Southerne's is high up in the aristocracy and in the royal court. Here he, in the dedication, gives credit where credit is due. He says, "I stand engaged to Mrs. Ben for the occasion of a most passionate distress in my last play, and in a conscience that I had not made her a sufficient acknowledgement." So basically, in a previous play, he had drawn on Ben's work without giving her credit. And so now he's saying, I'm going to make sure that I do that this time. I've run further into her debt for Orinoco. And here he also kind of compliments at the same time as critiquing her, because he claims that she had a great command of the stage. Like I said in my lecture about Ben, she was primarily a dramatist. So he's saying she was really good at writing plays, and I have often wondered that she would bury her favorite hero in a novel when she might have revived him in the scene. Which, okay, dude, she wanted to write a novel. You wanted to write a play. Get over it. He also uses it's interesting that he uses the term bury, that she would bury Orinoco in a novel. He uses this idea of Orinoco being dead in the novel, but coming alive again on the stage, as with each new performance, Orinoco can represent the story to a new audience. He says that maybe she just thought that no actor could do Orinoco justice, and I think since there were no African actors allowed on stage, that's partly true. Or he says she could not bear that he be represented. She didn't want to see him on the stage. I remember he's writing this after she has died. So she's not around to answer back to any of this. Then he adds to this by saying that she always told the story more feelingly than she wrote it. So not only saying, like, why didn't you write a play, lady? He's also saying she really told the story orally a lot better than she wrote it. So again, okay, dude, you're getting your whole story from her. Maybe you could be a little bit less rude, especially because she's dead and can't answer back. He then goes into this interesting meditation on, okay, well, really bad things happened to Orinoco and Suriname. Whatever happened, he has mended his condition in England. He was born here under your grace's influence. So again, Orinoco is having a rebirth on the stage. And through this play, his fame will spread and his fortune will be carried farther into the world. And so this is a pretty big statement, and again, kind of a jerky statement on Southern's part. But he kind of less so than Ben talks about Orinoco the character. Ben's narrative persona really talks about Orinoco as a historical figure, as somebody she knew, as her slave, as her prince. Here, instead, we have more of an acknowledgement that Orinoco is a character, especially because he's going to appear on stage played by a man wearing some sort of face paint, a white man performing as an African prince. And he's going to be accompanied by a white woman playing a white woman because, as I said, Imoinda has been transformed and whitewashed in this version of the play, of the story. A few other differences, other than that really big one, is that the play begins in Suriname. So we never see Orinoco in Africa, which does have an effect on his characterization. We never see him when he is a prince and not enslaved. The play also begins with a scene that would be familiar to Restoration audiences, a comic one featuring ladies talking about how to find husbands, which seems a little bit out of place given the graphic nature of the novel. And of the play. If you're going to end with someone being drawn and quartered, then maybe don't start with a sort of comic scene in which women are talking about how to find a dude. In part, imagine that you are going to the theater at this time. You want to get your money's worth. So you go for a tragedy, but you also want to have moments of comedy. And anyone who's read Shakespeare's tragedies knows there are usually moments or comic relief, as it were. This is an illustration from a later version. This is still Thomas Southern's, obviously. It's his text. But you can see the illustration at the top up here over the list of characters that clearly Imoinda is a white woman, and Orinoco here seems to be, I'm not exactly sure what he's doing. This seems to be around, oh yeah, around the time when she's about to be stabbed. And we'll talk about that death scene as well in our discussion. So we're going to Suriname because, as I said, that's where it begins. And again, I want to emphasize that we never see Orinoco in Africa. We only see him in the new Western world. And we also see him, we don't meet him until the second scene, which is important. The play is named after him, and yet he does not appear until the second scene. So the character of Blandford, who is very similar to the character Treffry, I never know how to pronounce his name, the white man who purchases Orinoco. His name is Blandford in the play, and he begins very explicitly with the one of the central messages I think that we get from Ben's novel, which is that most of the people that are enslaved along with Orinoco, they don't know any better. They were born so. They were born slaves, and they just change their masters. That's all that happens in coming from Africa to the New World. But a prince born only to command, betrayed and sold, my heart drops blood for him. So slavery is bad only if somebody who shouldn't be enslaved is being enslaved. Everybody else, it's fine. They were born to this. And so the play is already using the logic of slavery as an institution and employing that. And we'll later see Orinoco doing the exact same thing, being a mouthpiece for the institution. Now you might notice that Blandford's character is not speaking in iambic pentameter. He's not speaking in verse. Orinoco does speak in verse. He speaks in iambic pentameter, which, if you are familiar with Shakespeare and his plays and his sonnets, you most likely know what it means. But for those of you who don't, pentameter, pent as in pentagon, means 5 feet per line. A foot is 2 syllables, so that means each line has 10 syllables. Here we have an example of that, and this is Orinoco speaking in a section not included in your selection, but I wanted to show it to you anyway. If you're familiar again with Shakespeare's plays, then you know that usually the characters who don't speak in iambic pentameter are of lower classes or comic relief, so the gravediggers or the clowns, for example. So Southerne is telling us something by not having Blandford speak in verse and having Orinoco speak in verse. It gives us an indication of the differences in their character, their virtue, their honor, their socioeconomic position, even though Blandford is obviously in a position of power above Orinoco because of the color of his skin. And speaking of the color of his skin, here Orinoco proclaims that he is above the rank of common slaves. So Orinoco already very early on in the play wants to distinguish between himself and the people that he is now enslaved with, many of whom he himself enslaved or sold into slavery back in Africa. He plays here with skin color, saying, "Let the guilty blush, the white man that betrayed me, honest black, disdains to change its color." So, of course, it seems to be implying that people with black skin cannot blush. So we see Southerne engaging in racial stereotypes. But also this interesting idea in which Orinoco insists on linking guilt to white people. They can blush. They are the guilty ones. And I am honest and have black skin, and therefore I will not change my color with shame. So you have reduced me in this position. You have enslaved me, but I maintain my virtue while you Christians have gone against your word and betrayed me. He tells the story of how he met Imoinda, and this is also not included in the selection that you read, but basically her father came from Europe to Angola, because the play is set, Orinoco in the play is from Angola. And so Imoinda's father was the first white man he had ever seen. And he converted to their religion. Orinoco says he changed his God for ours. And then he became a military commander and was the commander for Orinoco's father. And during a battle, there was a poisoned dart that was heading toward Orinoco, and Imoinda's father stepped in front of it and received the poisoned dart and saved Orinoco's life. So when he returned, to the palace, he saw Imoinda for the first time, who was the only daughter of this white man, and therefore she herself is white. And in a scene that seems pretty similar to Othello's wooing of Desdemona, he tells her the story of their battles, of their military exploits. And in that way, and also notices, she's got it going on. And she bows and blushes, and he wonders and adores, and the rest is history. So they are married before they are cruelly parted. Again, Imoinda is white, and this makes a big difference in terms of her significance to the play, in terms of how audiences would associate with the main characters on stage. And I don't want to say too much about this because we'll talk about it at length in our discussion. But just think about what having Imoinda as a white woman does, especially in terms of how the audience might feel about her. And so Orinoco's father is the one who sells her into slavery, and then Orinoco is betrayed into slavery. Despite, being reduced to enslavement, it's very similar to Orinoco in the novel in that he is basically a slave in name only. And so he's pretty hesitant when Abon, who has also been enslaved with him and is his loyal follower, tries to encourage Orinoco to rebel. And he initially refuses. He says that basically if you're killing these men, you're killing innocent people. And he explains how slavery works and becomes a mouthpiece for it as an economic institution. He claims that the men that Abon wants to rise against did not make them slaves. So they participate in an economy and an institution that already exists. Now, if you imagine the audience sitting in the theater in London, many of them, if they are not directly involved in the slave trade, at least in part probably benefit from an economy that is very much related and bolstered by slavery. British ships are transporting Africans from Africa to the New World. British goods are being traded between North America, the Caribbean, and England. So the people sitting in the audience might feel a little bit better if they have a prince who has been enslaved telling them that, well, you know what, they didn't, they're not evil. They didn't make this institution. They are just participating in this institution. These men, Orinoco claims, bought us in an honest way of trade. And moreover, we've done the same thing. We have bought and sold many people. We never thought it was wrong. Of course, this overlooks the differences between slavery in Africa, where rival tribes would engage in warfare, and then part of defeat was potentially being taken as a captive and then sold into slavery. But that slavery was not permanent. It was not perpetual. It did not becoming a slave did not guarantee that your children would be a slave, and it was not based on skin color or alleged race. In North America, as we talked about before, slavery is based on on the subjugation of an entire group of people because of the color of their skin, and categorizing them as a separate race, and usually categorizing them as people who are not people. So this really is oversimplifying oversimplifying the situation, saying that basically we do the same thing. Well, no, that's not true. Orinoco has been sold into a slavery that will be perpetual, and the main reason that he eventually agrees to rebel is that his children will be slaves. And so that is different from the situation in slavery, in African slavery. And so it's really important to pay attention to Orinoco, the ostensible hero of this play, being a mouthpiece, and a black man, of course, though he's played by a white man in the play, being an advocate for slavery. And he also says, like, the load is so light that we don't even really feel it. We ought not to complain, because they have us in their power and they could do whatever they want, but they don't. So, let's just keep on keeping on. He continues this after his failed rebellion. So, of course, he agrees eventually to rebel because Imoinda is pregnant, and their child, his prince, he somehow knows that it will be a boy, though this is prior to ultrasound technology. But he knows it will be a prince, and he decides, therefore, he must rebel. And so once that rebellion has failed in the same way that it fails in the novel, he, very similarly to his novel counterpart, and here we have Southerne basically using the exact same language that Ben uses, he admits that it was folly of him to think that he could rebel. And he says, I now am going to blush quite through this veil of night, by which he means the blackness of his skin. And he still associates blushing with whiteness. I'm going to blush a whitely shame, to think I could design to make those free who were by nature slaves. Again, this idea of most of the Africans that he is enslaved with, if not all, being innately slaves, wretches designed to be their master's dogs and lick their feet. And like Orinoco, or Ben's Orinoco, Southern's Orinoco also accuses them of being dogs who only need to be whipped to accept Christianity. And he does not want to live on the same earth with these creatures. When they put off their noble natures for the groveling qualities of downcast beasts, I wish they had their tails. So basically he's saying they're beasts, but at the same time he's saying they are naturally slaves, he also says they have had to put off their noble natures, which seems to imply that they are not naturally slaves. So there's a lot of contradictory rhetoric going on here, but again, Southerne is using almost exactly Ben's rhetoric about people being naturally slaves. So in our discussion, we'll talk about if this play is in any way is anti-slavery, and again, I don't think it is, but also how the changes that Southerne makes influence the meaning of the play